Welcome, wrestling fans, to the Pro Wrestle Machine. Let's jump right into it. November 13, 2000 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. WWF not buying WCW, ECW November to Remember review. More. By Dave Meltzer. With the WCW crew en route to Europe for a one-week tour, the questions about the future of the company remain. With little substantial information available, much of the talk going around consists of rumors, but it is clear the two possibilities remain: the company will either be purchased by a group headed by Eric Bischoff, or have its expenses cut to as much bare bones as possible and remain part of Turner Broadcasting. While the rumors within the company were strong of the latter most of the week, that still seemed to be the least likely possibility based on those closer to the situation. Based on an article in the Online Broadcasting and Cable magazine, using Linda McMahon as the source, talks have broken down between the two companies. The WWF purchase, considered the most likely scenario just a few weeks ago, had strongly cooled in recent weeks. Vince McMahon publicly, as late as November 1st, had talked about it as being something the company was looking into, and it was still under consideration as late as the weekend. There is confirmation to the extent that Viacom, which owns 2.3% of the WWF and bought the exclusive rights to the product on cable for TNN and MTV, was initially unhappy about the company providing programming to rival cable stations TNT and TBS, even under a different company banner. However, most of those issues were said to have been resolved, and it is said that was no longer the major stumbling block. The same stumbling blocks remained from day one, basically the deal Turner Broadcasting wants for the company and existing deals that would have to be honored. The deeper WWF looked into it, the more existing deals the company felt were bad presented themselves. In addition, WWF wanted control of the advertising time, as it has with the Viacom deal and the UPN deal, and then pay the station a percentage of the time it sells itself as opposed to the reverse, which would be normal in most forms of television. There has always been a problem from the start regarding a difference in opinion on programming. The WWF wanted to cut WCW back to one prime-time show per week, most likely a show that would be aired live on Wednesday, thus eliminating the Monday night competition, and also to cut back on the number of PPV events WCW would hold, at least temporarily until the interest level picked up sufficiently for the shows to be able to do decent numbers. There was also said to be a major discrepancy in the feelings of both sides as to what the value of the brand name WCW and thus the value of the company was. The WWF appeared to be the leading candidate because Time Warner was looking at selling it off, but wanting to maintain the 4 hours of prime-time programming. The feeling seemed to be, based on track record, that McMahon would deliver better ratings for the station than Bischoff. During the week the rumors flew that Time Warner wouldn't sell the company, and would look into as much cost-cutting as possible, including terminate wrestlers under contract when their 90-day cycles are up, with the idea that, given the lack of leverage most of the talent would have, they would be able to rehire them at a lower deal. Many of the recent contracts called for a lower base and additional pay based on shows being worked, but with the company cutting back to mainly just one television date a week and one PPV per month and few house shows, wrestlers who expected 150 dates when they were figuring out their deal are going to wind up with less than half that. The downside is that any wrestler cut under those provisions would be able to immediately go to the WWF, even though they'd have little leverage to cut a good deal with the WWF going in. There is a value in 4 hours of programming that generally does between a 2.0 and 2.5 rating, which is well above the prime-time average for both stations, thus the company would be willing to put up with some losses, but clearly not losses at the level they've had this year. Still, those close to the negotiations believe both the stories that Eric Bischoff no longer has any interest and that Time Warner is looking at keeping the company to be more negotiating bluffs, with each side using it more as leverage to negotiate from strength. On November 6th in Chicago, between the Battledome angle, which is something that involves Bischoff, along with a taped interview for Thunder, which may not air for quality reasons, plugging the Tough Man show on FX, Fox's cable station, and there have been negotiations in the past with both Bischoff and Hulk Hogan with Fox about doing pro wrestling in the future, have led to the connect the dots theories putting Bischoff back in the driver's seat. However, even before that, the belief among key insiders at WCW was that the Bischoff deal was the most likely eventual scenario. But there was no deal done at press time. In its first PPV outing since losing national television ECW, with the toning down of the WWF, went as far as possible to re-establish the niche it once had in wrestling with the November to Remember PPV, which could have been appropriately subtitled, The Night of the Blade. The November 5th show from the Odeum Theater in Chicago before about 4,600 fans, which was 2,600 paying $122,000, seemed almost to be a show booked on the fly, left little in the way of structure, and ended with a new ECW champion crowned for the second straight PPV and Steve Corino. With WCW running in the same market the next day, the crowd, if people were looking for a comparison, had to be a disappointment since WCW not only outdrew ECW, but drew substantially more money with much lower ticket prices. Herein lies the dichotomy of the title. Rob Van Dam, the group's biggest star, has been kept from the title because, from an old championship perspective, the title is the holy grail and the fun is the chase. There have always been reasons, and logical ones at that, why the time hasn't been right. There was no point doing it before national TV. And there is no point wasting it now that there isn't national TV. However, that old school chase is only effective when the title is the cornerstone of the company and it's something that anyone can have. The classic chases that worked at the box office were those of a title that rarely changed hands. They wouldn't work, to the other extreme, at WCW where the title has been devalued to where holding it isn't any big deal. Seeing it change isn't any big deal. And thus, winning it means nothing either. In WWF last month, even though the belt changes hands relatively frequently, the only people who have held it all year have been the top guys and acknowledged superstars. While Kurt Angle's booking since winning it may be questioned, the fact is, it was positioned and protected enough that his winning it elevated him and didn't hurt the title, putting him in an elite company. Waiting for Van Dam to be put in the elite company for a title belt whose main lure, as pushed on television, was not that it signifies anything other than the storyline right to sleep with Francine, a belt that the holder isn't even the main event on the house shows, and that watching the three leading contenders beat each other bloody is less important to the audience than seeing a fourth guy, going for the title, show up several minutes late to the match, take several more minutes for his ring entrance, while, expectedly, the ring entrance was a bigger deal than the guys ripping and clawing for the title. Like Goldberg's quest in WCW, Van Dam's quest is for something no longer that important in the fans' eyes. The show itself was what you expect from ECW. A lot of wrestlers working really hard to impress. This was bloodier than usual, but slightly below the standards of the usual ECW PPV show, since it lacked the one blow-away match. Van Dam was in Thailand filming a martial arts movie, which was never acknowledged on the show, which took the group's one superstar out of the mix. Jerry Lynn and Justin Credible, who usually anchor the top of the card with strong matches, were put in a main event which went too long with a crowd already burned out from so much undercard blood, and their work, blood and sweat, was totally devalued by the idea of making Sandman's ring entrance take up 4 minutes while they were trying to work a semblance of a match with the idea something important, even if it was the right to sleep with Francine, was at stake. To their credit, Credible and Corino's work in the last few minutes after the two singles matches at the same time, which turned into just another four-way, was down to those two, was very strong and the finish was really well done. The announced lineup was changed on the fly, although it probably helped the show in the end. There were two unfortunate mishaps regarding usage of fire. And the most serious, before the show, Sinister Minister, Jim Mitchell, was working with a fire blower gun gimmick and there was an accident as he was playing around with it and it went off by accident. It left a bullet-sized hole in his stomach, tearing off a piece of his thumbs and forefinger and badly burning his left hand, which may result in nerve damage. He was rushed to the hospital in an ambulance, bleeding badly because it cut his wrist and severed an artery and he went into shock. He underwent plastic surgery, which apparently saved the hand. Luckily the shrapnel didn't penetrate into his internal organs. He had exploratory surgery the next morning and it is believed there is some nerve damage to 2 of his fingers and will probably need a nerve transplant. On television during the show, they attempted to explain the accident with the decision by Paul Heyman made for the announcers to claim that the FBI had attacked Minister and cut off one of his fingers as kind of a mafia-like hit, which came across incredibly gross, graphic, ill-advised and a decision that was heavily criticized by many in and out of the company. Angel of Debaldes, who took the power bomb through the flaming table, momentarily had fire burning on the back of his head and his back, suffered first and second-degree burns on his back and head. The real question to this show is economics. ECW is going monthly now. That's running twice as often at a time when the business is cycling downward and at a time when the company has far less television exposure. I think everyone agrees it would be better for the business as a whole to have fewer PPV events, but it's going to be next to impossible to get individual companies to make the decision to cut back because it's a risk that running fewer shows won't increase the buy rates and profit of each show and that even though long-term it may hurt the overall business from too much paid product, nobody wants to take the step that could hurt short-term in a business where nobody can predict long-term anyway. The combination of the TNN show and Hardcore TV was doing less than a 1.0 cum rating for the syndicated package. Take out the .64 average TNN was doing, .85 on TNN broken down to what the figure would be taken as a national figure, and you can see the audience syndication delivers. But ECW is a cult niche deal that survived on a very small audience from day one, relatively speaking, that was very loyal. If they can maintain their buy rates on PPV, which is still believed to be profitable, the move will be a success. If doing twice as many shows with less exposure results in a decline in buys to where PPV profits are cut down, the long-term picture is even more cloudy. That probably does necessitate more title switches and more gimmicks, because of running monthly big shows with a thin roster. Simon had a problem to start the show. He blamed Christian York and Joey Matthews for hurting Swinger, who, as it was revealed moments later, wasn't hurt all that badly since he was wrestling. He then blamed Joey Styles for not crediting him for injuring Tommy Dreamer. As it turned out, this was all a backdrop for what apparently will be the monthly angle injuring Joel Gertner so Cyrus can do commentary in his place. They never even acknowledged Cyrus having any role with anyone, so the explanation of him being there after the TNN split seems to be no explanation, he's just still there. The one interview blowing off the TNN angle where Cyrus was hooked up with Rhino has seemingly been forgotten as well. Diamond attacked Gertner. This time Styles jumped on Diamond and tried the old rear naked choke, which isn't nearly as lewd as it sounds. Swinger came in with a chair and Styles ran off. Don't know where he ran, but it took him forever to get to the announcing position. Dreamer ran in for his cameo, doing a baseball slide into a chair on Diamond's face until C.W. Anderson took him out with the old Anderson kneeling armbar submission. York and Matthews made the save to set up the opener. 1. Diamond, Pat Kenny, and Swinger, Joe Dorgan, beat York, Adam Birch, and Matthews, Jason Spence in 5:20. The first 3 o'clock had no announcing. If it was an experiment, it didn't work. Finally Cyrus came out, and seemed uncomfortable doing it solo. The idea apparently was, since this was an impromptu match, and in the angle, Styles was going back to get Dreamer for help, he shouldn't have been able to get back to the announcing position in time to call this match. Anyway, while that may make sense, it was a bad idea. Anderson used a spinebuster to take out Matthews while Swinger pinned York after the problem-solver double-team move. Diamond and Swinger kept on them after the match until Kid Cash made the save, including a springboard off the back of ref John Finnegan, onto the top rope and out on the floor onto everyone. 1 3/4 stars. 2. Cash, David Cash, pinned Anderson, Chris Wright, in 10:45. Styles arrived to save the day as far as announcing went. This match clicked better than any match on the show. Cash did a dive over the top into a Hurricane Rana on the floor. He also did a running leap over the guardrail onto CW when the two mistimed an old-style shoulder takedown. The crowd made sure everyone knew they missed the spot. They missed a few moves but built the match well with some spectacular moves and near falls. In particular, Anderson did an old-style Harley Race standing pausing suplex while standing on the middle ropes, as well as the Arnold Anderson spinebuster for a near fall. Anderson blocked the money maker, but Cash reversed again into a swinging DDT for the pin. 3 1/4 stars. 3. Danny During, Dan Morrison, and Roadkill, Mike DiPaoli, and Spike Dudley, Matt Hyson, beat Easy Money, Jason Broyles, and Julio De Niro, Brian Vall, and Chris Hamrick in 8:23. It was 3-on-2 until Spike came in for the big entrance, which was the first of many on this show. Hamrick took the Lucha Libre high spot bump where the heel runs and gets tripped up and goes to the floor. Hamrick has no look and no rap but is a tremendous bump taker. During De Niro, Money and Spike did a sequence of dives. They got some heat on Spike when Money clipped his knees. After a blocked acid drop, Money hit a powerbomb on Dudley. Roadkill did his springboard double clothesline. Finish saw Spike and Roadkill do a double-team diamond cutter on Hamrick with Dudley pinning him. 2 3/4 stars. 4. Nova, Mike Pucci, pinned Chris Chetty in 9:43 in an impromptu loser leaves town match. Chetty, who issued the challenge before the match, has taken a WWF developmental deal. One thing about ECW, in stips like this, they always honor them. They both worked hard. Nova missed a pescado. Chetty bladed right away from having his head ran into the guardrail. At times the work was a little off and the high spots seemed mechanical, but it built pretty well as they traded big moves, with Nova doing a lot of innovative spots. At one point, Lou E. dangerously hit Chetty with the phone to set up Chetty using Nova's own Novocaine spot for a near fall. Chetty clocked Nova with a chair, but Nova no-sold it and came back with probably the most fire he's ever shown on a PPV and a hot Enzui Jiri. Nova hit 2 pile drivers and went for a power bomb when dangerously hit him with the phone again for a near fall. Nova got the pin after a kryptonite crunch off the middle ropes. It was a little sloppy in the original setup, but the last reversal into the move looked great, even if the landing itself looked very scary. 2.5 stars. 5. Balls Mahoney, John Reschner, and Chili Willie, Will Jones, the DeBaldis, Angel Medina and Tony DeVito, in 12-11. It was what you'd expect, but probably a little better. Mahoney rattled DeVito's brain with a chair. Crowd was chanting for a girl in the stands to take off her top while these guys were massacring their foreheads. They brawled in the stands. Everyone ended up blading. Mahoney gave DeVito a very dangerous-looking nutcracker sweet off the middle ropes and a regular one to Angel. Mahoney and Willie sprayed 2 bottles of lighter fluid all over the table and balls put Angel through the flaming table for the win. 2.25 stars. 6. Rhino Terry Guerin retained the ECW TV title pinning New Jack, Jerome Young, in 7:55. Match consisted of nothing but New Jack hitting Rhino with one weapon after another until the finish. New Jack hit the first ref with a garbage can, which brought out heel ref Danny Daniels. He juiced right away. Rhino missed a pretty spectacular-looking splash off the top. Finish saw New Jack hit the guitar-shattering spot over Rhino's head. Rhino no-sold Jarrett's finisher, and speared Jack through a table for a fast count pin by Daniels. 3/4 star. They did a backstage angle seemingly to turn Corino heel where he was pouring out Sandman's beer while Jack Victory guarded the door. As it turned out, Sandman was in the bathroom, came in, Corino did the wimp backing down deal saying the beer was contaminated. 7. FBI, James Maritato and Charles Spencer retained the ECW tag titles in a match which started as Yoshihiro Tajiri and Mikey Whipwreck, John Watson, as the foes, but ended with Tajiri and returning Super Crazy, Francisco Pantoja Islas, in 1546. The worst thing these two teams ever did was have that incredible second match. It's almost guaranteed that every subsequent match, none of which have even been in the same league even though none have been bad, is disappointing. Whipwreck seemed a little off early. The crowd was really into Tajiri, who was incredible trading spots on the mat with Guido. At one point they sandwiched Guido's head in between chairs and each guy did a sliding kick to it. Whipwreck was taken out when he executed whippersnappers on both FBI guys at the same time off the middle ropes, and then started selling his shoulder big. To buy some time, Sal E went for a splash and ended up killing Mamaluke, who somehow survived this blow. The match stopped while Whipwreck was stretchered out. It was really sad on 2 levels. First, it came off as if they were playing off Paul Orndorff. Whether that was the direct intent or not isn't the case, as I'm guessing since Whipwreck had a legit shoulder injury going in, it was just coincidental. Since Orndorff ended up okay, it was better than WCW playing off Owen Hart in Kansas City with Canyon, but that's faint praise. Second, nobody, and I mean nobody, in the crowd bought it and in fact were chanting for the crazy run-in. Also, I felt sorry for the credibility of Joey Styles, first talking about how he didn't want to speculate on Whipwreck's condition out of fairness to his wife that was watching, then having his concern exposed by a crowd that never bought it and by the immediate run-in from Crazy establishing it as an angle. Crazy finally arrived to a huge pop at 8 o'clock, doing his bottom, middle, top rope moonsault spot, and landed with his knees on Mamaluke's face. Guido juiced. Match fell apart at this point and had no heat. Crazy did a spectacular moonsault block off a 15-foot balcony, although the cameras missed everything but the dive, which was apparently caught by Sal E. In the ring, Tajiri put the tarantula on Mamaluke, but Guido broke it up and bulldogged him for the pin, which nobody expected. 2.75 stars. 8. Steve Corino won the ECW title in the Double Jeopardy match over previous champion Jerry Lynn, Just Incredible, Pete Polacco, and Sandman, James Fullington, in 24:07. It was supposed to start as singles matches with Sandman vs. Corino and Lynn vs. Credible. Sandman wasn't there as they started the match. Fans chanted for Van Dam to be the 4th man instead of Sandman. After 3 o'clock of brawling, Sandman's music played. It killed everything they were doing in the ring as nobody was watching. Lynn bladed during this period. Sandman finally got to the ring at the 7 o'clock mark of the match and caned Lynn and Credible, so Credible then juiced. Corino then juiced, giving his old-school forehead more battle scars. There was no semblance of 2 singles matches as it was just a 4-way. Sandman suplexed Corino on a ladder for a near fall. There was so much blood already on the show, and by this point all 4 were bleeding in this match, and there was little crowd reaction. Sandman suplexed Corino on the guardrail. Lynn got his cradle piledriver on Credible, but Francine stopped the count by attacking ref John Finnegan. This brought Dawn Marie to the apron, but Corino turned himself heel again by kicking her out when the crowd was expecting the cat fight spot. The first two matches ended with a double pin at the same moment, which came off totally contrived, as Credible hit his tombstone on Lynn and Corino hit his neckbreaker, the old school expulsion, on Sandman in 1621. Fans hated this, maybe because it was two heels left, although Corino at this point wasn't a clear heel and the crowd took him still as a face against Credible. Lynn and Sandman each interfered once down the stretch. It turned into a big-time chopfest with Corino and Credible, which got the crowd finally into the match. Corino hit Francine with a super kick. Corino hit the expulsion, but Credible kicked out. Credible used Corino's super kick, right on the money, for a near fall. Corino hit the expulsion again, but Dawn Marie came back and gave both Corino and Jack victory low blows. The one to victory looked so lame as he's 3 times her size and he just stood there forever waiting for it. Credible nailed Corino with 3 cane shots, and by this time Corino was bleeding everywhere, before Corino hit a desperation super kick for the pin. Lynn presented Corino with the belt after, but then slapped him. After the show went off the air, Corino was surprised by his mother being brought to ringside after the show went off the air. 2.5 stars. I'm Next, The Strange Journey of America's Most Unlikely Superhero, by Bill and Steve Goldberg and Crown Publishing, is the latest of the round of pro wrestling books inspired by the sales of Mick Foley and Dwayne Johnson's books. The sad part about this book is the current release date. When reading the book, there is an overriding message that much of life is timing and luck. If this was 2 years ago, the book would have been a big seller. Now, wrestling isn't as popular and WCW and Goldberg certainly aren't as hot. None of this has anything to do with the quality of the book and has everything, far more than the quality of the book itself, with its eventual success. It's an easy read, without much in the way of depth. It's largely the story of a guy who didn't grow up as a big wrestling fan, although he did watch it at times in his life, who, because he worked out at a gym owned by wrestlers and lived in a city that many WCW wrestlers lived in, and had the right look and drive, was talked into becoming a wrestler after a less than stellar football career was over. It's about a guy with a combination of the look and being in the right place at the right time, and because of his religion opening up the mainstream media to him, becoming a short-lived cultural phenomenon. If you're looking for a book to give insight all those things, and his opinion of how and why they happened, you'll be disappointed. If you're looking at insight into the world of pro wrestling, and for someone who was a key part of both the high period and the fall of WCW, and to talk about the whys, you'll be disappointed. Goldberg goes over his life, and wrestling is a part of his life, but clearly, unlike Mick Foley, not nearly as important a part of his life. Goldberg comes across as honest, and his rep in wrestling for having a problem not understanding it's a work certainly doesn't come across here. He even brings up the secret loss before he debuted on Nitro. Unlike what internet sources have claimed, it was neither to Roddy Piper nor Hector Guerrero, but at a small spot show in Dalton, Georgia, to Chad Fortune. He's very honest as to what pro wrestling is, and what life training to be a wrestler is. He's even more honest about himself, and his strengths and shortcomings as both an athlete and a person. He makes it clear he can't call a match, and that often when he looks good, it's the other guy carrying him. He doesn't pretend to be what fans think he is. He clearly still is in awe of real athletes, and talks about his thrill in meeting the Shaqs and Bret Hulls and Gretzky and Maguires of the world that his wrestling fame has allowed to him actually in some circles become a short-lived hotter commodity than, which actually make him come across as a star-worshipping fan, and that his stardom has allowed him to meet people that he thinks are real celebrities. Because of that, there's way too much in the book of him being thrilled to have been able to drink from the Stanley Cup, or get free tickets to the Super Bowl and his various meetings with legit sports stars that his pro wrestling name value opened up. He makes no claims of being a tough guy, even though he clearly is. He downplays his football ability to a great degree. In many ways, when you compare Goldberg and Johnson's book, because they come from similar backgrounds from families filled with athletes, through the football system, the disappointment of not making it as a pro and into pro wrestling where they rose to the top in record time, this book blows away Johnson's book, but that only goes to show, in comparison, just how shallow Johnson's book is. Compared with the Capetta book, this is not in the same league, although no doubt it will sell far more copies. It's the life story of a guy who actually has a family that seems even more interesting than he is. Great athletes and all successful in their various endeavors. His background, economically and from a family standpoint, is totally atypical of most pro wrestlers. There were 2 interesting tidbits about the Goldberg family and pro wrestling. The first is that his great-grandfather, Morris Wolfson, was a pro wrestler at the turn of the century briefly and once had a match with Frank Gotch. The other is that his older brother, Mike, who played football at the University of Minnesota, in his college days had two roommates that were training at the time to be pro wrestlers, Ken Patera, and a guy who was later known as Ric Flair. If you're looking for his thoughts and insights into people in wrestling, you'll get a pretty straightforward view. He likes Rick Steiner, Scotty as well. Understands Kevin Nash is manipulative, but probably not to the degree he is, but likes him and credits him for helping him. Like most wrestlers who have worked with him, doesn't see through Hulk Hogan, and sees him as the man who made pro wrestling what it is. The only guy he admits to not liking is Scott Hall. More for his behavior in public outside the ring than for what he does in front of the camera, although aside from saying Hall treats people badly, doesn't go into detail as to why. As far as the colorful stories about wrestling that made the Billington book, honesty about the drugs, totally avoided, the nature of the promoters and many of the wrestlers, it's not here. Even the story about Triple H at the licensing fair isn't here, although in discussion of the WWF, he did praise Austin and Rock, and to a degree Foley although said he couldn't understand why he did what he did. He revealed one interesting story that never had been gone into before. When he was first negotiating with WCW, because Eric Bischoff was so slow in getting back to him, he was flown into Stamford, Connecticut and made a verbal deal with the WWF, but before he signed it, his agent got Bischoff to call him back. Given that it is doubtful WWF would have given a rookie, even with a look, anywhere near the same push, and granted he's the exception to the rule of someone who is a new wrestler who was lucky not to be in the WWF, it just shows what timing means, because he, had Bischoff not taken him, would have likely been in the same spot as Darren Drozdov, another ex-NFL fringe player with a cool look. Because football was really a bigger part of his life, there is more on his football career, which is interesting about life and the mentality of a fringe NFL player. In comparison to Johnson, this is probably where Goldberg comes across well. Johnson, fringe college player who wasn't even a starter in college and couldn't even make the CFL, tried to portray himself as a star in college football. Goldberg, a second-team All-American, portrayed himself as a 6'3" and 275-pound lineman, as being someone who worked hard, but was undersized, for his position in the NFL he was, and too slow. Even though he clearly didn't like the direction of the product under Vince Russo, he was careful not to be critical of Russo himself, which, given the time frame he was writing the book, is probably the smart approach. In fact, nobody got any blame. Not Nash, not Bischoff, not Hogan, for the destruction of both his company and his character. You could see he didn't like the heel turn, but he really didn't even go into detail as to why and even downplayed it somewhat, saying there were things he was looking forward to about it. He did say the Jim Duggan angle, using Duggan's cancer as part of a wrestling angle, went over the line. Maybe he didn't want to come across bitter in a book about a business that he was so fortunate in. Maybe he really didn't understand what happened. Overall, I'd give this a thumbs in the middle. I enjoyed reading more as a book about the real life of being a fringe NFL player who lucked out after football, than a wrestling book. If you're looking at it from the wrestling book standpoint, you'll probably be disappointed. But unlike a lot of wrestling books, in fact, probably the majority of them, when you're done reading it, at least you won't say that the writer was either insulting your intelligence or living in the fantasy world as opposed to simply working in it. Due to a problem at Nielsen where the audience for the final 11 minutes of Raw, the Austin vs. Rikishi and Angle main event, wasn't figured in at press time, we have slightly incomplete ratings for November 6th. Raw did somewhere between a 5.1 and 5.2. Not including the last segment, the rating was 5.11, 5.07 first hour, 5.17 second hour, and a 7.5 share. Nitro did a 2.55 rating, 2.98 first hour, 2.12 second hour, and a 3.6 share. The total head-to-head audience of 8.5 million was the highest since September 25th, the highly publicized first week of WWF on TNN. Monday Night Football with the Minnesota Vikings vs. Green Bay Packers drew a 14.56 rating and 25 share. Of what we know, Raw's high mark was a 5.52 for the DX vs. Radicals 8-man finish and Hardys vs. RTC. There was one weak quarter, a 4.84 unopposed, for Raven vs. Lawler. Nitro's Booker vs. Nash title match was a ratings flop, with a 1.89, making it the lowest rated segment of the show. Head-to-head quarters saw Raw at 4.74, McMahon's speech to 2.20, Page's return and Battledome angle, Raw at 5.27, more of McMahon's speech with Austin, Angle and Stephanie out. Undertaker vs. Venus, 2.09. Jarrett and Steiner vs. Sting and Bagwell, Raw at 4.93. Kane interview. Triple H recruits DX reunion, to 2.29. Rection vs. Wright. Goldberg vs. Bigelow, Raw at 5.33. Tanda vs. Too Cool. Beginning of DX vs. Radicals, to 1.89. Booker vs. Nash. SmackDown on November 2nd drew a 4.58 rating and 8 share, 5.26 realistic equivalent, and 8 share. The show placed 5th out of the 6 networks in its time slot. It did win among teenagers, 6.8 to 4.0 for NBC, and among kids, 3.9 to 2.8 for NBC, although Friends Head Up beat SmackDown among kids barely. SmackDown by market was 8.0 in New York, 6.8 in Los Angeles, 10.0 in Chicago, 6.2 in Philadelphia, 4.1 in San Francisco. Except for Monday Night Football, the Raiders and 49ers, and the weekend golf tournament, this would have outrated all sporting events on Bay Area TV all week. 4.4 in Boston, 6.8 in Dallas, 6.0 in DC, 5.9 in Detroit, and 6.8 in Atlanta. Thunder on November 1st did a 2.05 rating and 3.2 share. WWF weekend numbers saw Livewire at 1.1, Superstars did its all-time record low within 0.9, and Sunday Night Heat also did its all-time record low in its regular time slot with a 1.85 rating and 2.8 share. Now that we're 5 weeks into the season, we can pretty well say the new Heat formula is a bomb, as the show was doing consistent 2.6 to 2.7 ratings in the old format. The October 31st Lucha Libre block on Galavision did a 1.8 Hispanic rating, but where Galavision was thrilled was that in its target 18 to 34 male age group, it did a 4.4. Mexico. One of the strangest results ever in Mexico wound up with heel ref Tirantes getting his head shaved on November 5th in Monterrey at the AAA TV taping before 4,000 fans. It was a cage match, with Hector Garza, Humberto Garza Jr., Latin Lover, Pero Aguayo Jr., Sanguinario, Jerry Estrada, Zorro, and Heavy Metal, and the last man left in the cage gets their head shaved. It came down to 4 major stars, Aguayo Jr., Latin Heavy, and Hector. After Garza left, he tried to get back in to fight Heavy, but Tirantes got in the cage to stop him from interfering. At this point, Aguayo Jr. got out, and then Garza and Metal went out together, leaving only Tirantes in the cage. In an undercard match, Rocky Marvin beat Octagon Cheeto to win the Mexican National Minis title. Rocky Santana announced he would be retiring in January. Santana was a mid-card veteran who gained a cult following in Japan because he resembled a shorter Onita. At the November 3rd AAA TV taping before a nearly full house in Tijuana with jacked-up ticket prices, Headhunters no-showed with the announcement in the building that their mother had passed away. Main event saw Pirata Morgan and El Texano retain the Mexican National Tag Team titles over Heavy Metal and Pero Aguayo Jr. on November 10th. An indie group is running with Negro Casas vs. Ultimo Guerrero and a match billed to determine the vacant WWA tag titles with Lizmark and Lizmark Jr. vs. Silver King and Dandy, and WWA Minis title with Mascarada Sagrada defending the belt against the Mask of Paisito Coco Verde, a masked midget clown. Astro Ray Jr. retained his mask in winning a mask vs. hair match over Karloff Lagarde Jr. on November 1st in Puebla, a bout set up when Lagarde won the Mexican National Welterweight title from Ray Jr. in the same arena on October 25th. At the November 3rd Arena Mexico show, Pero Aguayo challenged Cien Caras for a hair versus hair mask, but also said he would put up his hair against the mask of Universo 2000. One match or the other is the likely main event on the year-end PPV show on December 15th. Aguayo said he would retire if he wins the mask from Universo, but then said he would still wrestle in a few more arenas he hasn't done retirement matches in. This guy has done the longest retirement tour in history. I remember him telling people in 1994 that it was going to be his last year. Negro Casas beat Bestia Salvaje in a hair match on November 6th in Nuevo Laredo. On November 7th, EMLL held an 8-team tournament to crown the new Arena Coliseo Tag Team Champions using its younger flyers, so the tournament should have a lot of hot matches. November 10th Arena Mexico headliners are Santo and Charles Jr. and Tarzan Boy, who will turn for the 13th straight week, against Wagner Jr. and Shocker and Scorpio Jr. plus Black Warrior and Cien Caras and Universo 2000 vs. Aguayo and Atlantis and Niebla. EMLL's November 24th Arena Mexico show will be Rayo de Jalisco Night, honoring both the father and the son. Between Santo and Blue Demon, and probably Aguayo on December 15th, that makes 4 shows in the last few months of the year dedicated to legendary wrestlers. Super Mega lost his mask on November 2nd in Naucalpan in one of those cage matches, revealing Juan Manuel Segura, 22 years old. Not sure if he's any relation to Mika Segura, who also works for the promotion. Super Crazy, before going back to ECW, dropped the old UWA welterweight title to Oriental on AAA TV. Crazy wasn't wearing the UWA title, but instead was actually wearing an old IWRG heavyweight title belt that Pirata Morgan left the IWRG with when he jumped to AAA. Crazy had held the title for 2 years since winning it from Jeff Hardy in Japan. All Japan. The lineups were announced for the tag team tournament. The plan at this point seems to be that the winner of the All Japan Real World Tag League tournament will face the winner of the New Japan G1 Tag League on New Japan's next PPV show, which is December 14th in Osaka. All Japan tournament opens November 19th at Tokyo Korakuen Hall with Genichiro Tenryu and Nobutaka Araya vs. Barry and Kendall Windham, Taiyo Kiya and Johnny Smith vs. Toshiaki Kawada and Masafuchi and Masahito Kakihara, and Mitsuya Nagai vs. Steve Williams and Mike Rotunda. They're back at Korakuen Hall on November 25th for Kawada and Fuchi vs. Kakihara and Nagai and Kiya and Smith vs. Dan Crawford and Yoshiaki Fujiwara. November 27th in Niigata is Tenryu and Araya vs. Jim Steele, formerly Wolf Hockfield, and Mike Barton and Kiya and Smith vs. Nagai and Kakihara. December 2nd in Sendai is Tenryu and Araya vs. Kiya and Smith, Kawada and Fuchi vs. Fujiwara and Crawford and Williams and Rotunda vs. Barton and Steele. The final show before the finals at Budokan Hall is December 6th in Sapporo, which in past years would mean the tournament would be booked with a bunch of teams still in the running, although that was Shohei Baba's style booking, with Tenryu and Araya vs. Kawada and Fuchi, Kiya and Smith vs. Williams and Rotunda and Kakihara and Nagai vs. Crawford and Fujiwara. They announced a complete 4-week January tour from Jan. 2nd to Jan. 28th. Hansen will only work the final night, which seems to confirm him only being brought in for big shows next year. Pro Wrestling Noah. Mitsuharu Misawa publicly talked about trying to get Shinya Hashimoto to work the company's biggest show in its short history on December 23rd at the Ariake Coliseum. This may be possible only because New Japan is trying to position Hashimoto as having quit the company so he can be an outsider when he comes back to feud with everyone, so having him work a show with this group works to New Japan's angle advantage. Misawa announced they would have a tournament to crown their first singles heavyweight champion in March, which would mean the tour would go head-to-head with All Japan's annual Champion Carnival Tour. They are expected to decide a junior heavyweight champion and tag team champions in January. The group opened its new tour on November 4th at Differ Ariake with sellout 1,800 fans for No Fear, Jun Akiyama and Takao Mori and Yoshihiro Takayama, over Daisuke Ikeda and Yoshinari Ogawa and Misawa. This group was also the only major league group to do a Yokozuna tribute, as Vader, often teamed with him when he wrestled as Kokina for New Japan, led a tribute to him, despite the fact he had never worked either for this company or for All Japan. Akiyama announced he was breaking away from the No Fear group after the show, saying that Noah needed more excitement, with him wrestling against Takayama and Amori. Misawa said that everyone in the company would have signed contracts by the end of this week. Nothing special in upcoming lineups. Takeshi Rikyo gets a singles match with Vader on November 11th in Kyoto, one with Akira Tao on November 15th at Korakuen Hall and one with Misawa on November 16th at Korakuen Hall. November 16th will also have a match to celebrate the 30th anniversary of Mitsuo Momoto's pro debut. Momoto, the son of the late Rikidozan, will face rookie Kenta Kobayashi. His actual pro debut is November 17, 1970 for the Old Japanese Wrestling Alliance that his father owned for many years. New Japan. Tokyo Sports, for whatever this is worth, has said that Masa Saito is negotiating to bring in Rulon Gardner for the Jan. 4th Tokyo Dome show. G1 Tag Team Tournament opens November 17th in Shiojiri with Takashi Iizukai and Yuji Nagata vs. Masahiro Chono and Scott Norton and Super Strong Machine and Jushin Liger vs. Team 2000 Machines. They run Differ Ariake in Tokyo on November 19th with Iizuka and Nagata vs. Manabu Nakanishi and Yutaka Yoshi, Kensuke Sasaki and Shiro Koshinaka vs. Team 2000 Machines and Machine and Liger vs. Chono and Norton. November 24th at Korakuen Hall has Sasaki and Koshinaka vs. Machine and Liger, Iizuka and Nagata vs. Machines and Chono and Norton vs. Satoshi Kojima and Hiroyoshi Tenzan. The biggest show of the tour besides the finals on November 30th in Hiroshima is November 26th in Kyoto with Sasaki and Koshinaka vs. Chono and Norton, Iizuka and Nagata vs Machine and Liger and Nakanishi and Yoshi vs Tenzan and Kojima. Nakanishi's wedding will be Jan. 6th. October 21st. TV was more from the Tokyo Dome. The show consisted of 2 very good matches and one of the worst matches you'll ever see. Takaiwa retained the IWGP Junior title, which he's since lost, over Kanemoto after a Death Valley bomb. Match was very good, but for whatever reason junior heavyweight matches traditionally get no heat at the Tokyo Dome, and this was a prime example. Kanemoto nearly killed Takaiwa with a Falcon Arrow, a form of a pile driver. Built to a hell of a match, 3.5 stars. Steve Williams pinned Scott Norton. Bet you could already guess this was the bad one. The funny thing is it had the most heat of the 3 bouts on the TV because it was inter-promotional match with the top foreign big man in each company. Williams at least tried, but Norton seemingly was doing his best to make sure the match had no hope. Williams even did a tope. It got progressively worse, particularly as Williams was unable to do his Dr. Bomb spot and they kept falling on the ground. They were blowing moves all over the place by the end. Very much like Vampiro and Awesome, except these guys were blowing basic moves and just standing there with no clue what to do next. Finally, Williams executed the second worst backdrop driver in history. Only Inoki's in the Leon Spinks match was worse, as Norton barely even went up to get the pin, -3 stars. Tenzan and Kojima beat Nagata and Nakanishi to keep the IWGP tag straps. Very good match, particularly Nagata and Kojima, who were both great. Nagata is among the elite workers in the profession these days. Nakanishi wasn't good, although in one case, when he suplexed both guys at the same time, they made him look bad by jumping at different times so the move looked like hell. They did an interesting spot during the match where Nagata accidentally spin kicked Nakanishi. Nakanishi then racked Nagata, but then threw him on Tenzan. Sensing the split, Tenzan held Nagata for a clothesline and told Nakanishi to do it. Nakanishi came in, Nagata ducked, and Tenzan got hit. Nakanishi and Nagata then high-fived each other. Went to near falls. Only other negative is Nakanishi did so many spears during this match that when he was doing them at the finish, people didn't react at all. Kojima pinned Nakanishi with a lariat at the end. 3.5 stars. October 28th. TV was more from the Tokyo Dome. They aired the Liger vs Super Delphin match, which Liger won with a brainbuster in 13:43. Match had no heat. They didn't do anything wrong, but it was nowhere close to what they did when they wrestled years back in a Super Juniors tournament. The match was average, with the highlight being Delphin's ring entrance where he came out with several of his Osaka Pro wrestlers, at least giving them exposure on network TV and on the big stage in front of 64,000 fans, and wearing a Liger mask. That was a takeoff from their previous match on June 13, 1994, when Delphin wore a half Liger and half Delphin mask, 1.75 stars. Don Frye beat Iizuka with a choke in 10:47. Total shoot style for 8 o'clock, with them rolling around on the mat doing a worked UFC-style match with no heat. Both guys appeared exhausted, as that style is physically more draining for the participants and less exciting for the fans, which on the surface sounds like a bad combination, but it is the way Frye has to be used for his matches to mean anything. They started doing a more UW Fish style, with trading punches and suplexes. They had a good exchange of punches which picked up the heat before the finish, 3/4 star. Main event was Fujinami vs Hashimoto. They aired about 10 o'clock of the match this time, which was more than on the October 9th show. Real good dramatic match with the sweat flying as they exchanged blows and Fujinami bled hard way from the mouth and lip. Probably the best singles match Fujinami has had in a long time. October 28th. TV drew a 3.1 rating. Other Japan notes. The November 12th FMW PPV show from Yokohama Bunka Gym announced the following matches: Koto Fuyuki vs Hayabusa in a no-time limit must be a pinfall finish match, Mr. Ganasuke vs Tetsuhiro Kuroda in a match where Ganasuke has to retire. Yeah, sure, if he loses. Goman vs Onryo, Homeless Jimmy and Supreme defend the hardcore tag team title against Mammoth Sasaki and Hideki Hasaka. Kyoko Inoue vs Naohiko Yamazaki in a man vs woman match, and Gedo and Jado and Kaori Nakayama defend the 6-man titles against Pat Tanaka and St. Louis area independent wrestlers Damian Blade and Brad Elliott. Inoki is trying to put on a UFO show in January headlined by Naoya Ogawa fighting against a name heavyweight boxer. The idea is to build Ogawa with a win over a boxing champion to go along with his win over a karate champion, Sadake, to build for the ultimate match against Rickson Gracie in the fall. Michinoku Pro ended its tag team tournament on November 3 in Aomori before 442 fans, with Tiger Mask and Gran Hamada taking the most points, beating Pentagon and Electroshock from AAA in 15:36. Going into the November 2nd in Kashima, Pentagon and Electroshock, Chima and Sumo Dandy Fuji and Tiger Mask and Gran Hamada each had 9 points, while Great Sasuke and Magnum Tokyo had 7. Pentagon and Electroshock then lost via DQ to Pantera and Genki Horiguchi, so they didn't get any points. Mask and Hamada went to a double DQ with Chima and Sumo Dandy Fuji, so they both also didn't get any points. Sasuke and Tokyo got 2 points with a clean win over Yoshiyuki Saito and Junji.com, so all 4 teams went into the final night with the same number of points. Sasuke and Tokyo went to a double DQ with Chima and Fuji, so basically both teams were eliminated instead of the winner going into the finals. This left Hamada and Mask versus Pentagon and Electroshock, with the winner taking the tournament. Taka Michinoku surprisingly returned on November 5 in Sendai in a 10-man elimination tag main event with Taka, who wasn't advertised, replacing Gran Hamada, with Sasuke, Tiger Mask, Tokyo, and Pantera winning in none falls over Pentagon and Chima and Masao Orihara and Sumo Dandy Fuji and Sasuke the Great, which is one mean trick since Sasuke the Great all along has been Masao Orihara. Yoshiaki Yatsu was hospitalized after his match with Gary Goodridge on the October 31st Pride show. He'll be back in action for a 20th anniversary tour for his own Social Pro Wrestling Federation from November 28 to December 3. Yatsu's pro debut was December 29, 1980 in Madison Square Garden against Jose Estrada. Gia is doing a tournament which started on November 3 at Korakuen Hall and ends on November 26 in Osaka to determine the number 1 contenders for its tag title held by Chikeo Nagashima and Sugar Sato. It was a big success as the November 3 show drew an overflow 2,200, which Chigusa Nagio and Meiko Satomura, who was being pushed as the new young star of the group, beating Toshie Uematsu and Bloody in one first-round match, and Dynamite Kansai and Toshio Yamada over Linus Asuka and Sonoko Kato in the other. The tournament continues with semi-finals on November 23 at Korakuen Hall with Nagio and Satomura versus Devil Masami and Kaoru, and Kansai and Yamada versus Akira Hokuto and Mayumi Ozaki, with the winners meeting on November 26. The winner of that match faces Sato and Nagashima for the titles on December 17 at Korakuen Hall. Koto Fuyuki said he is going to create a new FMW superstar over the next few months with Hayabusa out of action. The idea at this point is for Hayabusa to return after getting surgery on both elbows, which takes place after the November 12 PPV show on the annual Big Show on May 5. The Battlers promotion ran a show on November 3 in conjunction with a boat race in Toda, which meant their show was viewed by 15,484 fans. They also did a show match grandstand show before 1,821 students at Shinshu College in Nagano. Reggie Bennett is back in Japan working for JWP. Kyoko Inoue announced that in 2001, she would no longer wrestle against men. On the November 22 L1 show at Tokyo Yoyogi Gym, which is purportedly a shoot fighting tournament promoted by LLPW, the previous L1 tournament several years ago was a shoot, will feature several pro wrestlers, as well as foreign women including Russians that were supposedly trained by Alexander Karelin. Main event is Shinobu Kandori versus Yumiko Hata. JD will create a new singles champion in a one-night tournament called, get this, Queen of the Ring on November 26 that differ Ariake. CMLL Japan will be running a Jan. 27th to February 4th tour commemorating the 30th anniversary of Mil Mascara's Japanese debut, headlined by the Never to Retire Mascaras and his 2 wrestling brothers, El Psicodelico and Dos Caras. Report we got on the debut of Osaka Pro Wrestling at Korakuen Hall in Tokyo on November 6. They usually run their shows at a 250-seat small theater in Osaka, is that it was an incredible show. A lot of the reporters will say that Osaka Pro and Toryuman are the best house shows to attend. Osaka Pro consists of half-young wrestlers who have the athletic ability of New Japan junior heavyweights and have masked outrageous gimmick performers who are very athletic and fly all over the place. Super Delphin's win over Takahiro Murahama was reported as 4 stars, and the main event of Tsubasa, who tries to work like Ultimo Dragon, and Masato Yakashiji, a super high flyer doing a Bruce Lee gimmick, and Naohiro Hoshikawa, very good worker, over Daiuquat, doing a cane gimmick. And Black Buffalo and Dick Togo of the Top Heel group called Legion of Violence was reported at 4.5 stars. Togo in particular looked incredible. That's the whole deal we've written about a million times about the illusion of size. When Togo was in the WWF, because of his height and being put against all those big guys instead of being in a division where they are protected, for a box office analogy, see Oscar de la Hoya or people like Julio Cesar Chavez, Ray Leonard and Roberto Duran of another generation. From the illusion being destroyed, he was ineffective and had to do children's comedy, and thus people didn't even get to see his true working ability. Kept with people his own size, he was the best worker on a house show that apparently blows away most of what would be seen anywhere in the world. October 25th Coliseo TV show drew a 1.6 rating. Here and there. The stats regarding injuries, which we'll be going into next week in these pages, pretty well exemplify the remarks Bret Hart made on the Jim Rome show on November 3rd, saying that when he broke in, the wrestlers used to have a term for the fans, calling them marks, in that the wrestlers made the fans react the way they wanted them to and were basically in control of the show, making fans believe they were hurt when they really weren't. He said now the fans are in control and the wrestlers are the marks, with the wrestlers hurting themselves for real to impress the fans. The show, which was actually taped before the settlement of the Owen Hart case, but aired afterwards, due to the magic of post-editing, opened with a feature on the death of Owen and the career of Bret, and on the case being settled. Probably the most important thing said on the show, which for whatever reason, its importance seemed lost on everyone, as it may have been a key piece of evidence in the case, which we will do a major analysis piece on after it is officially settled because the background of this case is both sad and fascinating, is that Hart talking about the single cable rigging without a backup wire, as well as having a quick release, was, according to him, something the WWF was turned down by the company originally asked to do the rigging, claiming the stunt they had asked to set up was too dangerous. As noted before, the later company that did end up agreeing to do it used a harness holding him in the air with a snap shackle was not manufactured for such a thing, or for humans. It was made for sailboats, and the release button would activate with just 5 pounds of pressure. Despite many attempting to compare what Hart attempted to do with what Sting did on probably 100 or more occasions, they were similar in coming from the ceiling, but altogether different as far as the safety measures as well as the warnings given ahead of time if the story is accurate. An $18 million settlement, especially when one considers the actions of certain members of and the general nature of the Hart family as a whole since the death were the greatest allies the defendants could have ever had in the case, speaks volumes about which side of the line between unfortunate accident and negligence this fell. Since the particulars of the case couldn't be discussed, even though Hart ended up talking about a key piece of possible evidence that had never been released publicly, Rome tried to steer the piece strongly into the argument over whether the show in Kansas City should have been stopped, since it was a subject he personally felt strongly about and apparently was unhappy with McMahon's answers to the same question when he was on the show months back. Rome showed a clip of when McMahon was on his show and McMahon argued that Owen would have wanted the show to go on, using that as his reason for the decision to continue, out of respect for Owen's wishes. Rome at that point had said his family didn't see it that way, bringing up his brother, which McMahon defended by saying his brother had a vendetta against him, using the old Survivor Series defense for the death and the decision to continue the show, which has served within wrestling to many as a very effective propaganda tool, but to those outside wrestling comes across poorly. Bret on the show responded saying McMahon had no right to say what Owen would have wanted and that he believed Owen would have wanted the show stopped. Owen would not have wanted the show to go on. I don't think if you look at anyone with any common sense in their family, no one would have wanted the show to go on. If Vince McMahon would have dropped Shane McMahon from the ceiling and he splattered on the mat, I don't think he would have scraped him off the mat and sent the next match out. I actually know firsthand from the wrestlers involved, they wheeled my dead brother right past all the wrestlers and actually pushed wrestlers out the door and said, "Go, go, go, you're on." That is really insensitive and really cold. He said that when Owen left the house to go to Kansas City, he told Martha that he wasn't going to do it and he didn't know what made him change his mind. Since Hart has done so much media since the death of Owen, it has become easy for many to point at his complaining over various subjects as a way to avoid addressing any issues he brings up, whether valid or not. On this show, Hart's talk about not being able to get his archival footage and photos of his heyday, all owned by WWF, while a strong personal issue with him because he claims McMahon promised them to him and reneged, came off out of place and trivial compared to the subject matter of his brother's death. Hart also declaring himself the best as far as an in-ring performer, as opposed to one of the best, being that the latter category it would be tough to argue he doesn't fit into, would come off better to wrestling fans. For those looking to not like him, that didn't help him either, nor his blanket knock at current wrestling. Of course his points about it being more dangerous are borne out by facts and the different style of generally shorter matches does involve less storytelling in the ring, so his basic premise is accurate. Except for the injury rate increase, which is an underreported and very real issue, the changing of the art of in-ring wrestling is just a change in entertainment. Whether it's for the better or not probably depends on which era you grew up as a wrestling fan in. But to blanketly say that there are no more great matches is a disservice to the many young wrestlers who grew up idolizing Ric Flair and Shawn Michaels, who are now producing them on WWF PPV events. Rome himself hadn't done his research, talking about how wrestling has never been more popular, not realizing that the business already peaked and for the most part, except for one company, is in the toilet business-wise today. It was the typical reaction to Bret Hart in the media. To non-fans and those in the media, as well as to many fans for that matter, it's an amazing, compelling story of a career that, as great as it was in the ring for more than 2 decades, paled in comparison to the last 3 years, most of which was out of the ring, and he comes off very well as a backdrop to the story that there's a lot more about pro wrestling than a bunch of guys in costumes and fake names playing cowboys and Indians in their underwear. And for other wrestling fans, like on the other side, there is rarely a shade of gray. Hart will always give them enough ammunition negatively to avoid having to deal with some very unsettling questions about the entertainment form they love it and don't want to deal with the realities of. To his credit, Hart has attempted of late to balance his comments, talking about his good times in wrestling to offset his strong points that aren't positive, which has made him more balanced and actually made him come off with a tremendously positive response from even the segment of the audience somewhat conditioned not to like him in his last interview on Observer Live. The world of public opinion and the media is very strange and often very shallow. Over the past decade, I can recall 2 extreme examples of this phenomenon, in particular the fathers of 2 very famous murder victims, Polly Klaas and Ronald Goldman. The sister of Nicole Simpson falls into this category as well. Because of the prominence both deaths played as 2 of the biggest news stories of the decade, fathers, and other family members of victims, became unwilling celebrities. At first, they were sympathetic, noble characters, bravely dealing with the worst of possible tragedies. Similar to the Hart family in the Calgary media after the death of Owen on a local basis, they grieved for public consumption. But then, through overexposure by the media and put in a world they were ill-equipped to handle, and sometimes used by political forces for their newly found celebrity status, Klaas and Goldman became viewed by the public as whiners and were criticized to no end on talk shows when their only real crimes were their inability to get over the deaths of their daughter and son respectively by the time the public had gotten tired due to media overexposure of a hot ratings story and got tired of seeing them. Nancy Kerrigan fell victim to the same fate, built up as a princess and a superhero to every young girl by her coming back from the attack and being the star of one of the greatest made-for-TV dramas, almost a reality version of what pro wrestling attempts to produce in history. But then she almost became a heel when it turned out she was far from a perfect fantasy character and was just another human being with the same faults as everyone else, magnified by the media spotlight and pressure. In Rome's closing comment, he said the only thing worse than a brother dying a painful death is the knowledge that it could have been prevented. Rome was strongly negative to McMahon throughout the show, particularly in his closing comments when he said that the show shouldn't have gone on, and said it was the sickest, most cold-blooded thing I've ever seen. We're still waiting for an apology from Vince McMahon, one we know will never come. Dynamite Kid made these comments about the retirement of Bret Hart this past week. Apparently Bret Hart has just announced his retirement. In his farewell speech he talked about a ladder match we had in Stampede back in the early 80s. I remember that match as well. I remember all our matches, taped fist matches, mixed boxing and wrestling matches. We both gave 100% and had the people up off their seats. They loved it. And to tell the truth, said we. But I can't deny it was those kind of hard matches that put me in a wheelchair. I see people like Steve Austin, who get injured but come back to wrestling anyway, and I can't understand why any wrestler would want to end up in the same position as me. All said and done, you can't turn back time. Bret made the right decision to retire. I hope he has the sense to keep it that way. Cherie Dupree, who can claim credit for being the first known valet in the history of pro wrestling, passed away on November 5th at the age of 73 in Pierce, Florida. Dupree was the wife of Raymond Wagner, the real Gorgeous George as opposed to all the folks who later claimed to be the most famous wrestler when wrestling was at a popularity peak on network television in the 50s. By the time she was involved in the act, wrestling had long since vanished from network television and George was at the tail end of his career. Dupree had been ill for several years after suffering a stroke and also had emphysema from decades of cigarette smoking. Dupree worked as a model and a dancer in Las Vegas when she met Wagner, and the two were married on October 11, 1958, at about the same time she became part of his act. George had male ring attendants in his days as the biggest star on television before introducing his glamorous wife in the role. In one of the most famous programs of its time, George lost to Whipper Billy Watson in Toronto in a hair match on March 12, 1959, which sold out Maple Leaf Gardens with nearly 20,000 fans. 2 weeks later, in a rematch, George put Cherie's hair at stake in a rematch, which Watson also won before another packed house, causing Cherie to be what is believed to be the first woman who had her head shaved in a pro wrestling angle. She divorced George in 1962, 1 year before his death. There has been preliminary interest in the worldwide project involving the Fox network and the AAA promotion, most likely as a wrestling product for the Spanish-language market. The Brian Madden, listed as an MMA promoter in Illinois, who passed away 2 weeks ago from an asthma attack at the age of 42, was the same Brian Madden who worked as an indie wrestler in the Missouri and Illinois area in the 80s and was a WWF TV jobber, whose main claim to fame in wrestling was one of the wrestlers breaking up a Roddy Piper Jimmy Snuka pull-apart in one of their major angles. Victor Quiñones Iwa is doing a Bruiser Brody Memorial Cup over Thanksgiving weekend. Among the wrestlers working will be Tommy Dreamer, Yoshihiro Tajiri, Super Crazy, and Steve Corino from ECW. Bob Backlund had been running some funny TV commercials for his failed bid for Congress. Backlund, as the Republican nominee, got 30% of the vote in the 1st Congressional District in Connecticut. One of the commercials shows Backlund standing in a horse field rolling up his sleeves with horses around him and a guy shoveling dung all over his feet. By the end of the commercial, his feet and legs are covered with horse manure, said to be better than any pro wrestling promo Backlund ever did. A new promotion had a TV pilot made on November 3rd in Los Angeles called Extreme Warriors. The idea seems to be to put together an old Japanese UWF style of pro wrestling, not using anyone with a pro wrestling name and trying to sell it as a shoot. The broadcast team consisted of Don Fry, Brian Johnston, and Frank Shamrock to attempt to sell it as the real thing. The only name I heard as far as wrestlers involved was Justin McCulley, who I believe is under a WWF developmental deal, but also has a little bit of experience in New Japan and UFO and I think rings as well. Heard overall it was pretty bad. An Extreme Canadian Championship Wrestling show on November 4th in Bellingham, Washington was shut down by the Washington State Athletic Commission 20 minutes before the show was to begin because there was no presence of an ambulance at the show. The commission gave the promotion 3 options: get an ambulance, cancel the show, or run the show without an ambulance and face sanctions, which could include a permanent ban of the promotion from the state. A law was passed in 1999 that there needed to be either an ambulance or a paramedical unit. The interpretation previous has simply been having an EMT at the show as acceptable as a paramedical unit, which was done at a cost of about $20 and some free tickets for friends. A commissioner at the show interpreted the law as to mean there had to be an ambulance, not the either or as the way it appears to be worded. The commission stated that the requirement at previous shows not to have an ambulance may have been a previous oversight but needed to be corrected from this point forward. Before deciding to cancel, the company priced the cost of an ambulance with 2 EMTs and was given a $200 per hour, or $800 price tag, which is cost prohibitive on a show that grossed less than $1,200. C.J. Underwood, the longtime ring announcer for Jim Crockett Promotions shows at the old Charlotte Coliseum, now Independence Arena, passed away on November 7th after a 3-year battle with colon and liver cancer at the age of 60. MMA. Pride announced it would be running world title tournaments in both the middleweight, under 198 pounds, and heavyweight division starting with an early 2001 show at the Tokyo Dome. Sakuraba won't be entering the middleweight tournament, so basically they'll have a tournament to create a natural opponent for him for later in the year. Sakuraba at this point is scheduled to fight on both the December 23rd Saitama Super Arena show, most likely against Ryan Gracie, and Antonio Inoki's New Year's Eve show at the Osaka Dome. Inoki's December 31st Osaka Dome show will apparently include singles matches with Tokumitsu Ishizawa, Kendo Kashin. Hopefully they've learned and it'll be a work, Nobuhiko Takada and Masaaki Sadake, and he's also talked about using Shinya Hashimoto. ECW. Hardcore TV for November 4th as the go-home show for November to Remember really didn't do much for getting me excited for the show. The big push for the 4-way title match was pushing the idea that the most important thing wasn't the title, but who Francine would sleep with coming out of the match. Whipwreck and Tajiri beat York and Matthews in a good match. Whipwreck and Tajiri had some nice double team moves throughout. Spike Dudley pinned Chris Hamrick with an acid drop in 51 seconds. Hamrick did the old knee injury trick. Only thing humorous was when Hamrick talks, because he's got the accent, they say they need subtitles. The rest of Hot Commodity, Julio De Niro and Easy Money, attacked Spike, until Kid Cash made the save, but they overpowered him until Danny During and Roadkill came out. Lynn retained the ECW title, pinning heel ref Danny Daniels with a cradle piledriver in 52 seconds. Only thing notable was Dreamer was back on TV for a cameo. Main was New Jack and Corino over Credible and Rhino. It was the typical New Jack brawl with weapons with the music playing. The people were into it. Corino juiced right away. New Jack pinned Rhino with a chair off the top rope, which was probably pretty smart the way they played it up, since I don't think anyone saw it like New Jack had a prayer to win the TV title. Rhino speared Jack through a table after until Sandman came out and laid out Rhino incredible with cane shots. They teased a Corino turn when Sandman offered him a beer and he blew it off. WCW Nitro on November 6th from Chicago was a better show than the company has been doing of late. The positives were a hot crowd, as Chicago seems to be the #1 major market for pro wrestling, and a lot of the segments that could have been amateur hour weren't as bad as they could have been. There was also pressure to tone down the show, based on Burger King's stance on the current wrestling product, and this actually worked to the benefit of the show as some amateur hour segments were cut out. Luger ripped on Madden to start the show. Seems Luger was mad that Madden, of all people, said his body fat percentage had gone up. First off, it had. Second, Luger, who used to claim ad nauseum 4%, did his interview and said 5%. He made fun of Madden's physique in an unscripted segment that Madden didn't know anything about. It wasn't as bad in the sense as Nash going into business for himself on the Hall deal, which he's been told he can't do anymore, and since he's trying to rebuild his rep as a team player so increase his chances of WWF taking him next year, he's stopped. Still, it's another example of guys going into business for themselves on live TV, and as long as the company tolerates it, they have no right to complain when their written shows don't turn out as they are supposed to. Luger was backstage all day complaining about Madden of all people, ripping on his physique. Luger then brought out Ross Foreman and yelled at him for not having any photos of him in WCW magazine, which no doubt needs all the promotional help it can get. He attacked Foreman, whose selling was less than professional, and then Luger racked him. Foreman went out on a stretcher needing oxygen. That's a first from a torture rack. Storm beat Kwee Wee with a half crab. Meng made the save afterwards. They're going to put Meng and Kwee Wee together, and maybe give one or both new ring names. They were saying how Kwee Wee has his mean personality nobody wants to see, Angry Allen. Goldberg was doing an interview when he was jumped by Luger and Bigelow. Does that end the streak? Flair came out announcing Rection vs. Storm for the November 26th PPV in Milwaukee as their final ever meeting, Luger vs. Goldberg and Booker vs. Steiner for the title in a straitjacket match in a cage. Steiner came out and snatched Flair until Booker made the save. Jimmy Hart, doing an interview right out of 1981 WMC TV library, challenged any DJ and started ripping on every major DJ in the country. Mancow came out and did a promo and threatened Hart, until Moore and Helms and Hart all pounded on him. This came across much better than it had any right to. Jindrak and O'Hare won a three-way over Helms and Moore and Hayashi and Yang in a good match, ending with Jindrak pinning Yang after O'Hare did the Sienton bomb. Karagias did a run-in but everyone attacked him, until Jamie San, without his mask and looking clearly not Japanese, made the save. DDP came back and got a huge pop. He said terms like it's a shoot and it's for real so many times I thought it was an ECW worked promo. The interview was entertaining. This led to the Battledome angle where a bunch of muscleheads at ringside were taunting him. Cat Bagwell and Rick Steiner were his backup. They had a security pull-apart that got a ton of heat and was again so much better than it had any right to be considering amateur bodybuilders were involved. Jarrett and Steiner beat Sting and Bagwell. Very good heat. Finish saw Jarrett hit Bagwell with a guitar and Steiner use the recliner. The absolutely ridiculous thing is there is all this debris from a broken guitar all over the ring, not to mention the explosion of a guitar shot just a few feet from the ref, and somehow we're supposed to believe he doesn't know about it. Rection kept the US title beating right with a moonsault. MIA kept Disco from interfering and chased him away. Duggan did an interview about the election. Goldberg pinned Bigelow with a jackhammer. Goldberg had a lot of trouble with getting Bigelow up, which wasn't the last time he'd have the problem on this night. Booker beat Nash to keep the title with a pinfall, as once again, Nash is showing he's a team player. Finish saw Stasiak hit Booker with Nux. Nash then set up the powerbomb, but Stasiak then hit Nash with Nux and put Booker on top. Stasiak wiped his sweat on Nash after the match. Of all the young guys in the company to push to the level where they interact with the main eventers, they picked the mannequin. He's tall and has a good physique, and that meant something in wrestling back in the 80s. Thunder tapings after Nitro saw Jamie San beat Karagias when Moore and Helms cost Karagias the match. After the match, Jamie San saved Karagias. That now gives the big guys 3 teams instead of 2 to squash and give no offense to. Crowbar won the hardcore title from Reno due to outside interference from Vito. Conan beat Disco. Mysterio Jr. beat David Flair. David accused Mysterio Jr. of being the father. Came off lame. Nash vs. Stasiak saw all the thrillers turn on Nash and Booker made the save. Nash is back in the mix as a top babyface. Storm beat Meng via count-out when Meng was outside the ring with the death grip on both Duggan and Skipper. Booker retained the title, beating Awesome in a pretty good match. Match didn't get the heat it deserved. We're told it was due to nobody, because of his gimmick, taking seriously the idea that Awesome could win the title even with all his near falls. Clean bookend finish. Main was Goldberg winning a three-way, which turned into a handicap match over Luger and Bigelow. Luger walked out, leaving Bigelow in there alone. Goldberg couldn't get Bigelow up for the jackhammer, which may or may not be edited out. The finish of the Vampiro Awesome PPV match did go as planned, although much of the rest of the match didn't. Vampiro wasn't supposed to go through a table for the power bomb at the end. There is a ton of controversy surrounding Vampiro's medical condition, and it wouldn't surprise me if legal action wasn't taken or threatened. The story is that Vampiro suffered a concussion on the PPV and had numbness in his fingers the next day and told the trainer about it, and even with that knowledge, the bookers pressured him into wrestling in the tag match the next night, Thunder match, where he suffered another head blow and a second concussion. Those at WCW are skeptical, as they are often when injuries are real, and the skepticism is built from the fact some wrestlers have swerved injuries to get to stay home, noting Vampiro just had a baby and the timing of that, and the timing of the Bret Hart retirement due to a similar situation. However, on November 2nd, Ian Hodgkinson was examined by the neurosurgery department at McGill University and diagnosed with a concussion, and was told he could do no work, nor even light training or minor physical exertion for the next month, and that any expected time for a return to the ring couldn't even be determined. The reason the whole general reaction deal happened in Irvine, California, and the general feeling from just about everyone is that it was a great idea on paper that didn't work because the crowd was so small and didn't react, is that it was almost the company apologizing since they had gotten Bill DeMott so down that he was ready to quit. DeMott's feeling was that he had given up so much physically, numerous concussions, and he legitimately shouldn't be working according to his doctor, stemming from that he has blurred vision and has problems reading and sometimes has problems even walking up the stairs, and the company never gave him a push even though he had talent. He was ready to quit and go back to Japan where he felt the companies at least would recognize his ability. DeMott is generally liked as a person and respected as a wrestler by the rest of the talent. He was promised the US belt some time back and it didn't materialize, so the idea was to make a real big deal of everything as the company's way of apologizing, only it didn't come across as a big deal. Roddy Piper has filed a wrongful termination lawsuit against WCW. The basic gist is that he still had 1 or 2 matches left on his contract, which was a per-match deal at a very high per-match price, not sure of the number. WCW let him go, claiming he was disabled for longer than 90 days and unable to get cleared to wrestle, based on the torn bicep he suffered in late 1999. The controversy is this. First off, Piper continued to perform, finishing out his program after tearing the bicep, which is because he has that old school mentality even if it isn't something a sane person would recommend doing. He then got the bicep repaired. By the time he was given termination notice, he had been cleared on the bicep. WCW wanted him to take a full physical and get medical clearance to return, knowing he couldn't get it due to his artificial hip. However, he's had it for years and has worked his entire tenure with WCW with that same disability. He's in the process of writing a book. He was actually thinking as a publicity stunt of running for Prime Minister of Canada. He was thankfully talked out of it over the weekend. There will be no tapings on Christmas and New Year's. I believe the idea is that on December 22nd in Memphis, they will tape for Thunders on December 26th and Jan. 2nd. On December 25th and Jan. 1st, one of the dates will be preempted with a special on TNT, and the other date will air a compilation show. Numerous WCW wrestlers have called Eddie Guerrero attempting to have him open doors to them for WWF. Guerrero apparently told Juventud Guerrera, who is now said to be really upset because everything that happened to him is setting in, to wait a few months because, due to the incident in Australia, the timing isn't right to come in. He's told everyone that the first person he'll go to bat for is his nephew, Chavo Jr., whose contract expires in the summer. There was some question as to whether Jarrett would make Nitro on November 6th, since his wife is 1 week late in giving birth, but he came, and immediately flew back after the show. The original idea was for Flair to return to the ring for a match with Jarrett at the Mayhem PPV. Not sure if he'll make that deadline or if the match will be held off until Starrcade. There have been other candidates discussed for Flair's first match as well. The problem is that while Jarrett will probably have a good match with Flair, and it's important that Flair's first match back is good, there is no box office in Jarrett. Then again, there may not be box office in Flair against anyone else, either. Flair's best role is still in the suit and tie doing promos every week on television, and wrestling only on sporadic occasions and only with a compelling reason, and being protected in the ring with the booking. Fat chance that'll happen. For the November 16th Germany-only PPV from Oberhausen, the listed show is Kiwi vs. Skipper, Chronic vs. Kidman and Mysterio Jr., Sanders vs. Cat, Douglas vs. Conan, Jindrak and O'Hare vs. Wright and Disco, Rection vs. Storm, Booker T vs. Steiner for the WCW title plus a battle royal with all the undercard wrestlers plus Awesome, Bigelow and Smiley. Battle royal winner, probably Awesome, will go into a three-way against Jarrett and Nash. Winner of that match faces Sting in the main event for the European title, which hasn't been defended since Sting won it in 1994 from Vader, with Axel Schultz, the German heavyweight boxer, as referee. There is some thought Vince Russo may return for the November 20th taping. Bobby Heenan was told on November 8th his contract won't be renewed when it comes up for its 90-day cycle, as one of the first examples of the policy being put into place. It is expected that will be it for him, since the company was paying him nearly $300,000 per year at this point just to do worldwide voiceovers on a show nobody watches. It isn't certain whether Heenan will collect his money through the end of the year and continue to do the show or quit at this point. It is believed Heenan would be interested if the WWF would be interested in taking him back. He left the company 7 years ago when the WWF didn't renew his contract at that point in time because it was cutting back on costs, and he had a high salary. Heenan is not the only announcer believed to be at least soon to be put in the same situation. Tori Wilson was in Chicago and not used. There has been talk about her situation since, at $250,000 per year, she earns far more than the other women in the company, most of whom are not earning six figures and are basically viewed as cheap talent. Several front office employees resigned over the past week, which has furthered worrying among people in the company since they are the ones in the proximity of knowing what is really going on. Goldberg worked TV on a pulled hamstring. WCW is in the process of finalizing an agreement with Bill Behrens of the NWO Wildside promotion where the younger WCW talent that needs experience working in front of crowds, such as the Thrillers, will work his house shows in Georgia. WCW had been paying a lot of the wrestlers that worked out of Nashville $1,000 per week. The deal was $500 per night and most guys were working both Mondays and Tuesdays, as ran B security under Russo, but that was another thing cut in budget tightening. The general feeling is to expect a big announcement from Hulk Hogan when his WCW contract expires in March. The belief is that Hogan will be starting something up with Fox, and is trying to recruit Savage and Jim Hellwig to be part of it. As mentioned last week, feelers have been sent to various friends and wrestlers from Hogan basically saying to be ready because something is going to break, but not offering much more in the way of details. Of course, if Bischoff gets control, this all may happen, but would likely be used as the worked angle they've been wanting to do for months. There was also talk that Hogan would return at Starrcade provided Bischoff is in control by that point. ICP was on Stern, saying they left WCW because they wanted to concentrate on music, but also mentioned they quit over an angle where supposedly they were asked to turn on each other. November 6th Nitro in Chicago drew about 7,000 in the building, which was 4,390 paying $170,413, so they clearly beat out the ECW PPV held in the same city the night before, although they no doubt had a bigger ad budget. WWF. The WWF released to the public that its earnings for the quarter that ended October 27, 2000 will be affected by an additional $7 million in expenses related to settling the Owen Hart wrongful death lawsuit. It wasn't disclosed whether the money earmarked for the quarter is part of the settlement itself, the WWF share of the settlement figure with insurance covering the rest, legal fees connected to the settlement, partial financial obligations of the settlement, or a combination of all things. Since it's listed as an expense before October 27th and the finalization of the settlement wasn't until November 7th, I don't think it would be the settlement money unless they are taking the settlement out a little bit in each quarter to ease the blow as one giant cash outlay in one quarter would, if insurance isn't covering a lot of it. Triple H suffered a pretty serious hip injury on November 5th in San Antonio. He took a backbreaker from Kane and hurt a pop. Since he was the main part of the Raw show, being revealed as the accomplice so he could go back to his top heel role, he not only worked the show, but even worked the scheduled 10-man in his last babyface appearance. What's a DX reunion without Triple H anyway? It appears Survivor Series on November 19th in Tampa will be headlined by Austin vs. Triple H, Rock vs. Rikishi, and Angle vs. Undertaker. Raw on November 6th from Houston was an interesting, clever show. McMahon returned and did a political speech. He didn't endorse a candidate, perhaps feeling if he did, it would have double-crossed those that WWF worked with on a non-partisan voter registration campaign. However, they cleverly got their message across later in the show, so subtle that nobody can complain, but basically proving the disingenuous part of the non-partisan aspect. McMahon's interview was weird because he came out as Vince, as opposed to Mr. McMahon. Fans booed him heavily when he came out, and then he did a babyface promo, and one filled with irony, such as telling people to vote for the candidate who lies the least. Just as he turned face, Austin came out, and he transformed back into Mr. McMahon, with the exaggerated facials as Austin's scared rival. Angle and Stephanie came out as well. Angle actually got amazing heat this time, and Stephanie got in Austin's face. Angle jumped Austin, but it took Austin no time flat to make him look like a geek and hit him with the stunner without even breaking a sweat. Vince got Stephanie to leave. She wasn't sick, nor were there any hints of last week's sickness. Undertaker powerbombed Venus in a match better than it sounds on paper. Triple H wanted all four Radicals, unbeatable monster that he is. Foley, in order to give the Radicals a chance, being that Triple H isn't going to lose, ordered him to get 3 partners, so he reformed DX. Tanda beat Too Cool. Test throws the scariest high kick in all of wrestling. Albert used the Albert Bomb on Sexay and Test pinned him. Crash did a run-in after the match with a woman who was formerly Mona in WCW, dressed exactly like him, who will be called Molly Holly, which I guess makes Crash a Holly again, and she'll wind up affiliated with Bob when he comes back next week.
Between Molly Holly and Billy G, I think they've gone back to that mid-90s mentality on naming wrestles that brought us DL Hopper and Freddie Joe Floyd.
She nearly fell off the ropes trying a springboard move on Lita. WWF does so much better of a job in outfitting their wrestlers, as the same woman who wore that tacky dress on WCW had a totally cool look in WWF. DX beat Radicals when Triple H, who really couldn't even work the match, tagged in just for the finish of doing a pedigree on Malenko. Very good match with a lot of heat. Angle did a run-in and the Radicals attacked them after, with Angle getting a bunch of boots on Triple H. Buchanan and Goodfather won the tag titles from Hardys. During this match, Lawler got the message out, as Ross asked him who he was voting for, and Lawler said he'd never vote for Gore because Gore and Lieberman could be card-carrying members of the RTC. Ross did that fake WWF apology as if it wasn't supposed to slip out, and then even more slyly, without quite saying so, level-headed Jer pretty much said he didn't disagree. Ref bump at one point, so when Jeff hit the Swanton on Buchanan, no ref. Edge and Christian did a run-in, but Matt cleaned house on them. Richards hit Jeff with one of the belts as he was doing the poetry in motion in the corner, and Goodfather pinned him in 5:19. Angle went into Rock's dressing room and attacked him with the title belt. They need to make Angle seem more like a threat than simply a very entertaining character who is playing bad guy wrestler. Blackman pinned Kane in a hardcore title match when Jericho hit the ring steps Kane was holding with a chair, and he fell backwards and was pinned. Austin and Rock faced off on whether or not Rock was the accomplice. Lawler beat Raven via DQ in a match with no heat when Taz interfered for the DQ. Lawler really shows his age in the ring with all these young juiced-up guys. Snow came out with a head, and a second head with a crown, giving Lawler one, and they cleaned house after. Dudley's beat Inc. in a tables match when the Hardys came out. Lita gave Christian that flying Hurricane Rana, dazing him for the 3D through the table. After the match, Jeff put Edge through a table with a swanton off the top rope outside the ring. Rock was then injured backstage when a mystery auto knocked stuff into him, so Austin had to work the main event as a handicap match against both Rikishi and Angle. Triple H came out after Angle, but alas, he clobbered Austin with a sledgehammer, who juiced, left Austin laying, and as the show ended, revealed he was the accomplice. TV tapings from Dallas on November 7th for SmackDown saw Billy G over Guerrero via DQ and Radicals interfered in an IC title match. Hardys over Inc. Undertaker won a 4-way to get the title shot. Angle at Survivor Series over Benoit, Kane, and Jericho. Buchanan and Goodfather kept the tag titles over Dudley's. Blackman and Crash over Tanda, and Triple H and Rikishi ended in some sort of a DQ with Austin and Rock when Radicals interfered. Triple H was limping badly but still worked the match. Some SmackDown notes from Rochester, New York for the show that aired on November 2nd. Show was good, but seemed a little below the level of the previous weeks. Aside from the Rock Austin tease, nothing left a big impression, but nothing was bad. WWF seems to be getting a weakness on the heel side. Benoit, by being put into the Radicals once again, has been devalued. Rikishi just doesn't have it as top heel, and his frequent interviews on recent shows are only making it more obvious. Angle is great, but is still being booked as a geek, and that role isn't conducive to being a top draw heel because he isn't portrayed as a threat. Watching the four-way women's match was scary, because Stratus nearly got hurt on a few occasions clumsily trying to take Hurricane Rana spots. Jericho was buried both in commentary and in booking when, even with a chair, he couldn't last 15 seconds with Kane before being laid out, and then the commentators portrayed Jericho as if he was Crash Holly or Taka Michinoku by saying Kane had attacked a man half his size. The whole gimmick of getting smaller guys over is illusion, and they put the illusion the wrong way. Kat was already gone from Guerrero, probably because Terry will be with the Radicals. If RTC censored Billy Gunn's entrance music, doesn't that make them babyfaces? They couldn't have given the former Billy Gunn a more lame ring name than Billy G. Sounds like some pop star from another era. I guess if they want to turn him into a Barry Manilow-like heel, it's a good name. Also, Mr. G and Chyna have zero chemistry together, made worse by them walking hand in hand to the ramp while neither even looks at the other. Nothing wrong as a tag team, but when they were holding hands, it made the pairing look totally fake. Rock vs. Angle had a really good match to end the show on a strong note. It is considered a very strong probability that Davey Boy Smith will be let go. Right now, the priority as it pertains to TV is that SmackDown and Raw are considered equal as shows. At one point, when Raw was the established show and drawing a larger audience, it was considered as the A show and SmackDown is below it, but with SmackDown actually drawing a significantly larger audience since Raw's audience has dropped this month while SmackDown is staying at a strong level, they are given equal attention. Because they are giving the talent Christmas and New Year's Day off, which is actually something new in wrestling. Raw will be taped those 2 weeks. The Christmas Raw will be taped on December 22nd in Chattanooga, while SmackDown for December 28th will be taped on December 23rd in Nashville. The New Year's Night Raw will be taped on December 29th in Austin, while the Jan. 4th SmackDown will be taped on December 30th in San Antonio. There was a Chef Boyardee ad on the SmackDown show on November 2nd. We're not sure what the status is. Brent Bozell last week claimed Chef Boyardee and Slim Jims were pulling out of SmackDown. It could be that they are pulling out after current commitments, and it could also be an incorrect claim. Burger King did pull out the previous week, although technically in their case they completed their agreed-upon commitments and didn't renew, but told WWF it had nothing to do with outside pressuring but simply a decision they made regarding advertising. There were discussions about bringing back Scott Hall now that he's a free agent, but the reaction was negative on virtually every front, from the wrestlers to the agents to the front office, so at this point it isn't going to happen. There was a strong thought that even if he is straight, he still isn't the type of person they want right now, being that he's 42 years old and hasn't been productive in the business in years, had a history in the company when he was younger of both frequent injuries and being a disruptive force in the dressing room. Buff Bagwell also did himself less than no favors with his interview on the website last week. The naked Midian aspect of the character based on Survivor has been dropped. Dennis Knight will remain on the roster and use the Midian name. Some Ross Report notes for this week. Rock will also be off all the December house shows, which actually only means shows in Tulsa, Amarillo, and Raleigh, for the same reasons mentioned last week of him getting off the November house shows. Undertaker returns to the house shows on November 11th in Cincinnati. Farouk's knee operation included repairing a torn meniscus and removing bone spurs. He'll be out of action another 4 to 6 weeks. X-Pac has re-aggravated his previous neck injury with a form of whiplash in the cage match on the PPV and will be out 3 to 4 weeks with rehab therapy. Bob Holly will be sent to OVW to train to get ready for his November 13th comeback. Christian has seen 3 doctors about his stinger suffered at the No Mercy PPV. He hasn't missed any dates, but is not 100%. All the doctors said they didn't think the injury was serious and the MRI showed no herniation of a disc or spinal cord problems. Taka Michinoku won't be undergoing shoulder surgery. He's recuperating from his injury in Japan, and surprisingly, started back in the ring on November 6th for Michinoku Pro. Tori is back on December 3rd as a wrestler. She'll be part of another WWF Divas photo shoot in Jamaica. They are hoping for Bradshaw to be ready for Survivor Series on November 19th with his broken ribs. Sylvester Turkey of OVW had arthroscopic knee surgery and will be out 3 to 4 weeks. Mick Foley appears on Conan O'Brien on November 16th to promote his Christmas book. Big Show's weigh-in on November 3rd was 443 pounds while Mark Henry was 348 pounds. Show has also fined 1 week's salary a few weeks back, which for him is nearly $20,000, for missing a weigh-in. Of the hoes that China destroyed, Mandy has been released and is expected to go back to work with UPW in California. Victoria is being sent to Memphis. Rikishi was wearing a nose protector, which means he probably suffered a broken nose over the weekend. The Jim Ross WWF Cookbook is expected to crack the top 10 in self-help books on the New York Times bestseller list. Apparently, the MCW vs. Power Pro feud in Memphis was largely spurred on by WWF and WMC TV. Since the local NBC affiliate will be broadcasting the XFL in February, they were looking at a cross-promotion. Since Memphis has a team, it made sense to regain power over the traditional wrestling show in the market. The idea is that the MCW show moves to a later time slot so the shows don't go head-to-head, and the companies work together to do a feud. The entire MCW roster appeared on the November 4th PPW show, including Pushing the Dupes vs. Mean Street Posse feud from MCW on the show. The MCW roster consists of Lawler, Bobcat, Posse Dupes, American Dragon, Shooter Schultz, Banky 7, Headbanger Thrasher, Scott Vick, Hey Crush, Lady Ophelia, Lance Cade, Steve Bradley and Jason Sensation, as well as trainer Tracy Smothers. They aired an interview with Foley saying that he was the new commissioner of Memphis Wrestling as well as of the WWF. Dave Brown then said Randy Hales told him that wasn't the case. SmackDown tapings on October 31st in Rochester, New York drew 6,022, paying $200,945. House show on November 4th in Las Cruces, New Mexico drew 5,638, paying $189,505. They did split crews on November 5th, with half the crew in Lubbock, which drew 8,571, paying $288,810 for an afternoon show, and the rest in San Antonio, which drew 7,845, paying $243,040 for an evening show. Raw on November 6th in Houston drew a sellout 12,478, paying $378,494. Arena merchandise for the week was $330,397, which is $8.15 per head. They no longer have, in the case like on November 5th with afternoon and evening shows, have the wrestlers do double shots, and instead use a totally different crew with the exception of Austin. Austin worked the main event in Lubbock and then was flown to San Antonio to do an interview/stunner angle, since Rock was pulled from the road, and with Undertaker not going back until next week. In Las Cruces, it went with Austin and Jericho over Rikishi and Venus as the main event. Guerrero was the super babyface because he grew up in the area for his match against Billy G. He wasn't as strong a face as the last show in Las Cruces because he's a stronger heel on TV, but even though he attempted to heel on G, the fans were still with him. They were also said to have had the best match on the show. Austin and Rikishi were out of character in the main event completely, as if something happened which only they knew. As Austin was destroying him, both guys were cracking up for no apparent reason, and every time they were near each other they couldn't keep a straight face. They had Raven challenge for the light heavyweight title, but still in the ring intros announced him at 230. Lubbock had the same crew as Las Cruces, with Austin and Jericho going on beating Venus and Rikishi midway through the show so Austin could have an easier time making San Antonio. The readers' pages. Apathy on deaths. The apathy that seems to be increasing with each death of a young wrestler has to be seen as an alarming trend. It's true that Rodney Anoa's death wasn't a surprise. That makes it no less tragic, or less worthy of outrage, considering wrestling's obsession on physical appearance being such an important factor once again. Vince McMahon encouraging Anoa'i to gain weight for the Yokozuna gimmick is no less despicable than if McMahon told a wrestler to take steroids for more muscular development. This takes McMahon to a new level in deplorable irresponsibility when you consider that at the time he gained the weight, he was already grossly out of shape and just 25 years old. The WWF kept him on the payroll and tried to change his eating habits, but it's comparable to putting an alcoholic in rehab after you've spent 3 years encouraging and rewarding him the monster push and the 2 WWF title reigns for continuing his problem. Was this the only time dangerous weight gain has been encouraged? The nature of the Rikishi gimmick, and the fact Solofa Fatu was brought back into the WWF with all the added weight he gained since his days as Sultan, while Paul White and Mark Henry have been disciplined for their weight gain, really makes me wonder. Jeff Lowe. This is the Pro Wrestle Machine.